Okay, thank you once again, John, for a very informative presentation. And you may know, I just want to say this for the benefit of the membership here and at large before we move to the questions. You know that APPA has a very open and extremely diverse mission and vision statement. We don't use the word diversity, but we entail it because we have people in the association from every walk of life, every religious belief or none. It's not because of APPA, it's because of philosophy, which is obviously so portable that there's hardly anywhere it doesn't go. And we have practitioners on every continent except Antarctica. And I'm waiting for one of you to get down there and do some Socratic dialogues with them. There's a permanent scientific community that also could use, I think, some ministry in Antarctica. They're closeted during the dark season, and they have nothing to do probably but play games. It would be really great to have a practitioner down there for a little while to do some philosophy with them. They're very bright people, no doubt. But seriously, John, you know, we have had coming through our certification programs, we have priests and ministers and rabbis, and I've done philosophical practice in Islamic countries, not too many, but a few. And on the secular side, you know, we have dyed-in-the-wool materialists and atheists, scientists of all kinds, medical people. So this, once again, is about the portability of philosophy, and that's exactly the kind of thing you addressed. Devil's advocate in me almost wants to ask why you need a church to do this, but that's a devil's advocate question. I want to turn things over to the membership now, and I think Patricia has her hand up. Please go ahead. Patricia.
Yes, can you hear me? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. So, yeah, John, I really liked your presentation, your talk, and entirely. I can say I feel at home in a way, because some concepts and something that you said, like creating this, or being part of this group with the role of facilitator instead of a teacher, and a group non-academical with a strong aspiration to transparency and with a big space for critical thinking and a strong commitment for individual intellectual honesty. I can share the experience, because being a facilitator in a group is the experience I had last year with a group of clients and friends. I mean, clients who at the beginning came to me with existential issues or problems or things that they wanted to be shared and decision to be taken, but then they turn to become a part of a group of discussion on topics that they had decided to discuss, that they wanted to go deeper. So their need to solve some problems had turned into the need to discuss together about things that they found important in their life, concepts that they took a space in their life last year, like a sense of death that the COVID had, or the need of freedom because of the lockdown, or the need to understand what is true and what is not because of the fake news going around. I mean, a group that had decided to discuss about topics that had a spiritual background, but they were simply philosophical topics. And we discussed together, not in an academical way. They started to discuss in a free way, being honest and transparent. And I simply facilitate the dialogue, sometimes using books or text or poetry or philosophical or example from cinemas or from newspapers or whatever, but simply being part of them and learning from them exactly as they learn from experience, exchanging a very pair way, being pair in this discussion. So I found and they want to, now this group of people is going on, 2 people adding, so from 4 to 6, I don't want it to become too big, otherwise there is no space for discussion, but they had it as a concept. So from big concepts like freedom or death or body, they just discussed about youth, feeling youth, wanted to remain youth, or vaccine, to be vaccinated or not, because it's not so, and trust, another concept that they choose. So it's very interesting, your experience. And I like the quotation of Wittgenstein, your source. I feel sympathetic about your philosophical source as well. And yeah, I liked your presentation a lot. Yeah, methodology and experience and sources and yeah, what's going on. So I really liked it. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you, Patricia, for your comment. John, I endorse all of that Patricia finished with. I think you're doing a fantastic job as a facilitator, which, as you know, it's not easy to do, but you've really done a great thing to help to shape and to continue this kind of work. That's really commendable.
Yeah, thank you, Lou and Patricia. The question, why is a church needed? It's not, in principle. Look, had I founded something that was called something other than a church, that was 1,200 members committed to this reflection and dialogue, I would have joined that.
Yeah.
So I was looking for a community, not necessarily a church. I didn't find something called that was not a church or a synagogue that was offering that. So that's the reason. But I mean, yeah. I mean, I know there are a few things here and there. I guess I've never actually been in one, but if there were some sort of Epicurean garden I could join, I would do it. But I need to find one. So that to me is just what was life changing, to find a community that was committed to what I would consider philosophy in many ways, but and so seriously committed to it. I should say, in terms of the issue of dyed in the wool, I mean, I'm an atheist. 80% of the people there are atheists. So I would describe myself as a materialist also. I've written about that. So just to be clear, this is, I mean, please don't get hung up on the fact that there's a steeple on the building. This is a bunch of atheists who get together all the time to discuss ethical and existential questions.
Right. No, please don't misunderstand me either. I'm just being devil's advocate. You know, I was born like that. But you answered the question in your slideshow. Actually, you already did, because that building, whatever you call it, steeple or not, was founded in 1821, right? Okay, and that's 200 years ago, and it's still standing, and it still has members who come. So that is a great achievement culturally. Just let me share with you, before we turn to the others, that, you know, I did a similar thing in Manhattan for 7 years every month in a bookstore called a Philosopher's Forum, and I had a similar crowd, a very tough crowd of New York skeptics, an intellectual hothouse, and it was a wonderful learning experience. It was like being a lion tamer going in there with 40 people, you know, ready to chew each other out. But here was the thing. It was conducted in a Barnes & Noble in Chelsea, which was the big intellectual center of the day. That has vanished. So your building is still standing and is doing well. The place in Manhattan where I did a Philosopher's Forum for 7 years is now just what Manhattan needs, another clothing emporium. Barnes & Noble failed because Jeff Bezos put them out of business. And, you know, I'm not knocking Amazon. I love it, of course. They sell my books. But we don't have that venue anymore because you're not going to have philosophers invited to a clothing store usually. Okay, so hats off to you, John. You found the right group and the right theme and the right place to do it, and I think you're doing great. Okay, that's just fantastic. Buona, please, and then Lydia.
John, I loved your presentation. It was great. I wonder, I think Michael, perhaps you know of Michael Picard, who is a long-term practitioner and is, I think, currently working on translating Achenbach, which should be a task in itself. But he also, as I understand it, is working on an anthology of articles on philo cafes. And I wondered if you see this within the tradition of the philo cafe, and if you see any major differences between what you're doing and a philo cafe. My other question, is, do you ever explore a topic in a series of discussions? For example, we have a pipeline that's coming through our community to the distress of practically everybody. And so I've been running a discussion group, not only on pipeline issues and environmental issues, but conceptions of nature and how important nature is to us. And we have nature walks and so on with philosophical discussions. And I'm wondering if you have it, perhaps would have a series of talks on COVID, or whether this was just confined to one discussion. So those two questions.
Usually one discussion. Again, the discussions blur into one another. Occasionally we'll do kind of a part two if we really feel like we just didn't do justice to it. But no, we don't. The classes I've taught all have a thematic or topical focus. One, for example, was think about the nature of tragedy. So that sort of thing. But no, they're typically just a standalone topic. In terms of the difference between this and the Socratic cafe or philosophical cafe or that sort of thing, if that was the question, this is occurring in a community. So those are, it doesn't have kind of the transience of what those groups might have or what the bookstore discussion might have. These are people who are not only united through the discussion group, but they're part of the community. They're seeing one another get married. They're bearing one another. Of course, that means they don't return for the discussions. They're part of the community in other ways, and to that extent, there's just a much deeper and stronger bond amongst the participants who are getting to know one another through this philosophical dialogue, but we know each other typically already in other ways. And again, there's just kind of a deeper kind of connection. I'm seeing Rick and Andrew's hand.
Yeah, we have Lydia, and then Rick, and then Andrew.
I was just wanted to comment that it seems to me that your groups are much more like those that Pierre Grimes runs, where there is a sense of community. So that's very interesting. Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Fauna. Lydia?
John, it was such a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
That it was a sort of philosophical practice for all of us. You know, we got to be clarified somehow and illuminated somehow and processed somehow and fascinated somehow and cleansed and opened. So you have to know that it's either your personality or your way of thinking or the pace that actually makes the form and the content go along very well. And you depend on other people to change the slides. And every time you said next slide, I heard next life. So this was absolutely next life. Absolutely wonderful. I wanted just to add, when you said we keep to be sometimes fascinated, and that's enough, it reminded me of the group in Denmark that Finn Hansen, for example, works with Wonder Labs. So through your talk, I was wondering if these Wonder Labs that he does all over the world and in Scandinavia, working with health, might interest you, because he's working with people that work in the health facilities, etc. And all over the world, he creates these labs, these dialogues in which they reach wonder about common, less than common concepts or notions. So through your talk, I began to think maybe there is some kind of spiritual background to the practitioners in Denmark or in Scandinavia that make them maybe stop us at wonder. So I'm just giving you this reference so that you can maybe read Finn Hansen or contact him or just.
Thank you. And briefly, and this is responding indirectly and also to some of the other comments that have been raised, I do not consider these terms religion, spirituality, God to be self-explanatory. Those are themselves questions that we explore, and it's by no means clear historically or philosophically what are meant by those. They've been defined very differently over the years. That's why I say, is what we're doing worship? In some sense. Is what we're doing divine? I don't know. What does it mean to be divine? And on and on. Is it religious? Well, I don't know. Let's think about what religion is. So, to that extent, I don't. We're problematizing itself, these categories of when something is religious and when it stops being religious, when something is church, when it no longer is a church, and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Thank you.
Rick?
Okay, Rick, please.
Yeah, yeah, that was a great talk,
Thank you.
John. Thank you. A lot of really rich stuff there. I think one thing I wanted to point out is that you're very fortunate to have a kind of intentional community that already has so many values that overlap with this activity that we want to do, you know, philosophical practice. So that kind of like handed to you on a plate, really, to have that. But you don't need that, as Lou said, you know, cafe in Manhattan or whatever, or Patricia's version. Accidentally, I just fell into something that I wanted to share, just so that maybe others would like to do this too. Several months ago, a friend of mine asked me to get involved with some kind of philosophical debate he was having with some people on Twitter. So I got in, because like he called me in because I'm his philosopher friend. But it was a bunch of kind of amateur philosophers in there arguing, and some of them were really friendly and some of them were like trolls. But I got involved for a while, and then I realized it was so painful dealing with the trolls, but I really enjoyed engaging with the people who were just genuinely concerned and everything. So what I did, I just said, you know, I remember this saying, former karate teacher of mine once said, it was a kind of Yogi Bear kind of guy. He made a remark once when I think I criticized or I complained about something going on in the dojo. And he said to me, if you don't like the games people play, invent your own, right? So with the Twitter thing, you know what I said? I'm just going to start my own philosophy cafe online, low-tech Zoom philosophy cafe, and invite those people from the thread that I thought were respectful and genuine and whatnot. I did it. I've been doing it for a few months now. We meet every Sunday for 2 hours. Sometimes it goes into 3 hours because the conversations are just great. And we've got between about 6 and 10 people who show up out of about 15 people that I've invited all together. It's a wonderful experience just for its own sake. So it has all the same benefits, even though there's no community in the background. Mm-hmm. Almost nobody in there knows anybody else outside of Twitter, maybe 1 or 2 people. So I just wanted to share that as a kind of possible idea for other people. It's very rewarding.
Yeah, thank you, Rick. And you're reminding us, as John is reminding us, that philosophical practice is more than one-on-one counseling. It's a lot more. And working with groups is a very important thing that actually we can all do one way or another. So great, good for you too. We still have some comments coming, questions coming. Andrew, and then Gary, please.
Yes, thank you. John, I thought it was a great presentation and you're doing really good work, it seems to me, and raising really important questions, specifically about the relationship between philosophy and spirituality, philosophy and religious traditions, because, well, as you know, there's this kind of love-hate relationship between the philosophy and the spiritual traditions. Philosophy can be at odds with religious traditions, but at the same time, philosophy has within it, as we all know, deeply spiritual concerns, spiritual practices as well. So exploring that, I think, is really rich. You asked about, you wondered whether about what you're doing when you're doing philosophy is a kind of worship. And that reminded me, by the way, of a really nice line from Heidegger, that questioning the piety of thought, which seems to be, makes it seem almost as if philosophy is a kind of worship. Questioning is the piety of thought. I thought very deep. But Lou raises the question: do we need to do this in churches? And then that made me think, well, maybe, of course, no, we don't. But I wonder if churches need this. You happen to be involved in a church that's very open-minded and very, as you say, has values that are very sympathetic to philosophical inquiry. But, you know, I think it's also quite likely that there are lots of churches that do not share those types of, that type of openness to philosophical reflection. Questions that came to me is, I mean, any advice for someone who might want to do this kind of thing in a much more conservative church setting? Because I think in many ways, that's where this kind of thing might be needed almost more than in a universalist, Unitarian context.
I mean, I've never tried to do this in a much more orthodox or conservative environment. One thing that you do, though, is a lot of interfaith kind of dialogue of talking to Muslims and Buddhists and all the rest. So there is sometimes that engagement with much more orthodox faith communities. But I mean, I don't think it would necessarily, I don't know. I don't think it would necessarily work to just sort of show up as an outsider and say, I want to do these in your community. And there's no doubt, there's all kinds of communities. I can only imagine evangelical Southern Baptist or something that you wouldn't get anywhere, unfortunately. So, yeah, I just would encourage anyone who has some religious involvement or is perhaps interested in it. I guess I'm saying two things. One thing that I think it's useful to appreciate the extent to which philosophical reflection, by a broad definition, is happening in many houses of worship. Lutherans, Presbyterians, and everything. That's what they do. They sit in the church basement and talk about these issues of what should we do as a community, what would be just, what would be, what's the right thing to do. Again, often it's in a theological framework that you might find extremely dubious, but when I was sort of visiting various traditions before I ended up in UU, I was struck by just how thoughtful the reflection and dialogue that was occurring in mainline religious institutions. So I guess part of what I'm partly saying that it'd be great if someone could develop a practice like this in another community, but I'm also suggesting that, you know, we live in many ways in a very non-philosophical society, but I think one of the places it's happening is in religious communities. Again, defining it broadly and occurring with a lot of limitations.
May I just add that, I mean, you're absolutely right, John, and I think that your answer is very sagacious, and I'll tell you why, and we'll move on to our last two questioners. But I want to say this, it's important. My rule of thumb is that don't go door to door to religious communities trying to sell this like, you know, encyclopedias or vacuum cleaners, but if they come to you, then welcome them with open arms. I've had for many years really a student of philosophy who's a rabbinical leader in a very, very ultra-Orthodox Jewish community, but this man has a mind which is so philosophical that he is expansive in his curiosity. So he's willing to go outside the Torah and outside of the Jewish scriptures in order to examine questions. This is rare, but if someone like this is in the world, they will come to a philosopher. The scariest email we ever had in 21 years came from Regina Apostolatorum, which is the innermost sanctum of the Vatican. It's a secret university within the Vatican. And they have instituted a course in whatever their version of philosophical practice is. But they came to us for guidance and wanted to send someone into one of our training programs because they saw the need. And if the Vatican sees the need from the inside, then I dare say that that's a need that you know, is pretty much everywhere in religion. But I think the rule of thumb is don't go to them. If they come to you, welcome them. And that's really what you were saying too, is it not?
Yeah, it is in part. Yeah.
Okay. So I know that Gary has had his hand up and also Katerina did. We're running out of time, but let's go. Gary, can you be brief again, please?
Sure. I think I can be quite brief. There's the positive, if you like, reinforcement. I mean, having taught philosophy of religion off and on at Ryerson, where we have a very diverse student body, And the first year course that we run is tough. I mean, a lot of the readings are tough. We get a very diverse range of students from religious backgrounds who are very curious in the course. So I find what John is saying fits perfectly with my experience. I certainly think that philosophers should be open as philosophers to talking to people about religion, because you'll get some of the most interesting conversations. So I want to really strongly reinforce that. I just had it's a curiosity question about the church that I think might have a productive side to it. And it's that I was thinking at first about the Quakers when you started talking about the church and their practice of scrupling, where people come together and their consciences are troubling them, and try to decide what it is that's troubling them and what they can do about it. And it connected to this other aspect of religion, which you didn't mention, but I think works with a philosophical discussion very well, which is service. I think a group that talks about philosophical issues, possibly like a happily functioning philosophy department, right? They do exist, I think, often finds itself bonded partly by service. And so there's a kind of grounding to the philosophical discussion in service. And I don't know if that's been a part of the practice at the congregation you're part of, but it seems like it might be a really interesting dimension to add if it's not there.
Yeah, I mean, the church is very active in social justice matters and community service. So often we will pick a topic such as issues of racial justice. We're discussing racial reparations for slavery, for example, in 2 weeks. So yes, we will pick topics that very much are seen as, linking and ideally informing the more activist community service kind of work that the group is doing. So
right.
Okay,
thank you. To change the discussion when you're doing that. Anyways.
Thank you very much, both of you. I would like to ask Katerina if she still would like to ask John something or comment. I did see your hand up, Katerina, I believe. Are you still there?
Thank you, Lou. I lowered it because of time, but what I was going to say is that I had been attending a UU church in New York City throughout 2019, and I did really value the fact that they had this openness to learning from, all spiritual traditions and other forms of wisdom. For me, the limitation was that there wasn't enough of an analytical, more rigorous component. So I can see that what you're providing to the church is exactly what it needs from my perspective, a chance to cultivate the skill of being more analytical. Yeah. In terms of how your group might be benefiting from the ethic of the church, it occurred to me that one way is that the church cultivates this spirit of humility and openness to listening, and that is a important component of philosophical engagement. So if you don't want people showing up and just being really opinionated and trying to win an argument, it helps to have people who are already part of a community that's based on these principles.
Yeah.
Just some thoughts.
That's helpful. And one thing that's really been edifying to me and becoming a part of this community in the past 2 decades is an appreciation of values that are emphasized less in philosophy, strictly speaking, biblical values often of humility, of reverence, of gratitude, and those sorts of things. So it's affected my own ethical development and has affected the nature of the group, that there's I think just a greater presence of some of those values, including humility, that itself just give a certain tone to the discussion. So I want to thank everyone and also say that, I really appreciate everyone's receptivity to this. I have to say I felt almost a little anxiety thinking that I'm going to be talking to a group of probably largely militant secularists. I spent most of my life as a militant secularist, so I hear you. I would have, come to this with incredible suspicion had I been on the other side 20 years ago. So anyway, I really appreciate your attention and your interest, and look for the articles forthcoming, and I'd love to correspond further with anyone.
Thank you so much, John. It's really been a great presentation. And if you have any lingering anxiety, hook up with Carolina. I think she might be able to help. Okay, so on that note, we'll take a very short break. We're going to come back.